Welcome to the program. We tend to think of misinformation and disinformation as a byproduct of the digital era that we live in, of the ever-presence of cell phones in our lives, of social media channels, algorithms that we don't understand, something born of a modern era and a fractured media ecosystem. But the manipulation of truth as a weapon, the deliberate shaping or reshaping of reality itself, is far older than any of these modern tools or technologies, far deeper and more systemic than most of us realize. My guest today has spent his career mapping that hidden terrain, tracing how power operates not just through armies and economies, but through stories, through identity, through emotions, and belief systems. Peter Pomerantsev is a journalist, author, and leading global expert on propaganda information warfare and authoritarian influences. He's a senior fellow at the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies, where he focuses on democracy, disinformation, and global political warfare. He's also a visiting senior fellow at the London School of Economics, working at the intersection of media, technology, and democratic resilience. Peter was born in Kyiv, Ukraine, grew up between Eastern Europe and the West, and studied at the University of Edinburgh, where he earned a degree in history, an academic foundation that deeply informs his work on empire, ideology, and the long arc of political power. He is the author of several books on these topics, including Nothing is True and Everything is Possible, an early and prescient account of how post-Soviet Russia pioneered a form of politics where reality becomes fluid and performance replaces truth. That work was followed by This Is Not Propaganda, a global investigation into how modern information warfare targets identity, grievance, and belonging rather than facts. And his most recent book, How to Win an Information War, looks backward to look forward, examining how democracies have previously fought propaganda and asking the deeply uncomfortable question of whether defending truth sometimes requires tactics that risk undermining it. Today, we're going to talk about misinformation and disinformation warfare in concept and principle, not as just abstract ideas, but as the lived political forces that are shaping elections, wars, social cohesion, maybe the future of democratic society itself. It's a conversation I've been looking forward to for a long time as a host of a program where our whole objective is to find the deeper truths by asking the best questions we can, but to ensure that we're not allowing ourselves to be soaked up into somebody else's alternate universe and twisting facts into some version of reality that is dissociated from everyone's lived experiences. And so it's an important topic. We spent a good amount of time going through the basic definitions of some of these terms, misinformation, disinformation, propaganda. We talked about specific examples, and we applied it to both current events as we record this program in January of 2026, but also looking forward to the challenges and threats that the future is likely to bring to democracies and autocracies alike. So, I am privileged to present to you my full conversation with the author of How to Win an Information War and one of the leading global experts on the topic of propaganda and information warfare, Peter Pomerantsev. Peter, welcome to the program.
Brian, thank you for having me.
All right, so we're going to use a couple of terms throughout the course of this conversation that will be recurring. And I would like to start off by having you set up for us the plain language definitions when we use the terms misinformation, disinformation, and propaganda.
Okay.
They are often used interchangeably, but sometimes there is a key difference in the meanings. And I think as we go through the topics today, it's important to ground ourselves in what these three things are. So maybe for the benefit of our audience globally, how do you define misinformation, disinformation, propaganda?
So misinformation is the accidental spread of falsehoods. Disinformation is the purposeful spread of falsehoods. Propaganda is where it gets tricky. There is no one definition. I mean, like, if we're being very, very bare bones, it just means mass influence and in the interests of the party producing the mass influence. Yeah. So it's often contrasted to education, which is not meant to be for the benefit of the people creating it. But propaganda usually takes on a negative sort of meaning. It usually means some sort of manipulation or deception, but it doesn't have to. Its original meaning with the propaganda fide was the Catholic Church's sort of command to go and propagate the faith in order to push back against um, the Reformation, the rise of Protestantism in Europe, which is just persuasion, and in many ways, some scholars say that the negative aura we have around the word propaganda in English-speaking countries stems from the fact that it came from a Catholic persuasion campaign, so therefore it's evil. So there are some people who say that our kind of deep-seated negative reaction to the word is actually a consequence of the wars of religion.
So as we think about its use in our world today versus in the past, you've written a number of books on this topic going back into various chapters of history. Can you give us a sense from your expert perspective about the use of these tools today versus historically? The fact that we have so much more information globally, news information, misinformation can spread like never before. But is it really at a scale any different than the past, or is it the same old tools being used in a new era?
So there's always a revolutionary moment with propaganda when there's a revolutionary moment with technology. So there's this giant leap that happens with print, giant leap that happens with radio, and now a giant leap that's happened with the internet and digital world. But I have to say that the rhythm is often the same. There's first a moment of idealism. When radio appears, people write about it a bit like the early social media, that it'll bring peace and interconnection. People say, well, there'll never be wars again because people can hear each other on radio from different countries, so they'll never fight. A bit like the sort of connecting people mantra and idea of the emergence of a global village that came with the first excitement around social media. And then very quickly, one realizes that it also has broken down, for better and worse, all the taboos, all the norms, that it lets our darker sides in without really an understanding of how you give any checks and balances, and that it can be used by very, very evil forces to enable violence, hatred, genocide. So it's in that sense, I suppose what we're going through with um, the digital is very similar to what we went through with the emergence of radio. I mean, and a lot of the arguments are the same. So in the early 20th century, there's a big argument about whether society is now so information dense that basically people can't deal with democracy because it's just too chaotic, too complicated, too much stuff out there. And therefore we need centralized control. And then we have the same arguments being made today that, in a data-rich world, you need centralized control to guide society. So arguments that you hear both in Silicon Valley and in Beijing. So there's so many echoes. I mean, what is of course very new today is that it's no longer a one-to-many media, which you used to have, but it's a many-to-many media with social media. But then at the same time, the more you dig into it, yes, we can all talk to each other. Everybody has a voice, but the control over algorithms is even more concentrated than the old control over individual newspapers or TV channels. So we used to complain that, oh, the TV channels are controlled by 5 people. Well, sort of the dominance of some tech platforms, I think, is bigger than that now. So yes, it's many to many, but then the real levers are in the hands of very few.
You made an important distinction right off the top about misinformation and disinformation. The intent is the key difference. Is one more dangerous to the other, in your view? That just because misinformation may not have come from an evil intent, is nonetheless spreading lies, maybe unintentionally, maybe innocently. Is that
Mm.
more or less dangerous than somebody who's deliberately doing it, and it could potentially be countered because you know the intention
Mm.
of the actor?
So I think neither of those are the way to think about danger. Danger starts with the harm it causes, whether accidentally or on purpose. So you always have to start with the effect. So generally, especially in today's environment when there's just so much content out there and so many campaigns, you're going to go mad trying to track everyone. So my advice is always focus on the effect something is having. Is it damaging an important institution like elections? Has it got a health effect? So start with the harms and work backward. And frankly, a lot of the time it'll be a mix. Something may have started off as misinformation, becomes disinformation, it then becomes misinformation again. I mean, things get pretty chaotic. But I think neither of those categories are the right ones. So the main one is to think about is the effect. Now, the effect is often to do with the intent, in the sense that if somebody's intentionally going after something, that could make the harm much greater.
So let's talk about. I think the biggest challenge that we face as a world today is defending against this. And you have written extensively about the information warfare, and of course, warfare in general would have two sides to it, right? There's people who have offensive means, and there's people who are trying to defend against those weapons. Can you give us a sense, maybe historically or even today, of the best defensive capabilities that you have seen for countries, societies, or even individuals who want to avoid being victims of a misinformation or disinformation campaign?
Um, yeah, I mean, there's limits to the military metaphors you can use because actually words don't work like bullets. They don't sort of shoot at you and penetrate you. And if we're talking about propaganda, largely in its grandest form, it's something that people desire and want because it explains the world. It gives them a narrative to live through and a communal identity. So I'd be careful with these military metaphors. Information war is something quite specific, really, if we're talking about it from the Russian point of view. But generally, we're talking about something much, much more sophisticated, complicated and human than the kind of logic of military. And when we frame this as like disinformation versus, I don't know, truth or something, I'm not sure that's the right framing. We're talking about something which is so much more part of our lives than thinking about it as something outside attacking us is not doesn't get you very far. But in terms of an individual rather than a systemic approach, look, I mean, I think it's very. I think what's changed is that I grew up with an idea of media literacy um, that basically said like if you're confused about something, go and check lots of sources. Yeah. And I think it was related to various cliches like knowledge is power and more information will make you more empowered and this whole kind of logic. And I think now we see that isn't linear. You can, nowadays that just means you'll be up till 2 a.m. going down rabbit holes. Um, if you get to bed at all. So um, I think the idea that just spending more time online will help cure you of the online chaos is already a completely incorrect approach. You have to kind of turn your attention inwards, and if you want to be free of manipulation to a certain extent, it's really about understanding how your own emotions are working. Yeah, understanding what scholars call metacognition, how your mind works, how it processes information, being very wary of effect. What is the effect that somebody's trying to do and mitigating that? So if their effect is to break your will or make you confused, if you're getting confused, you're playing into their game. Um, and there's different sort of techniques of getting good at that. I'm looking at them in a book that I'm writing now. I mean, in terms of emotions, there's lots of uh, exercises you can do from kind of psychology, basically, sort of talking through the emotions that you feel when you see a headline, trying to analyze them, trying to understand why you're feeling them, then comparing the emotions you feel from the headline and the text itself. Yeah, is there a difference there? All about giving you emotional distance. On the metacognition piece, there's a really useful set of questions you can ask yourself, and others actually. How sure am I in what I believe? Where have I got this information from? Then, more importantly, how would I feel if somebody disproved it? If I feel kind of violently attached to it, there could well be something going wrong. Yes, that's a very good way of working out if you're really in control of your own beliefs. So I mean, it's all about turning the gaze inward slightly. I actually really been inspired recently reading about how people survived Maoist indoctrination camps in the early decades of communist rule in China. It's very interesting. So there, they had to go through very, very intense thought control processes, whether in universities or in prison, which really sort of makes you realize just how absurd all these sort of charges of thought control today are in the West. If you want to see some real thought control, check that out. But it's interesting how they worked and how people found ways to resist them, because they're universal ways of resistance, whether you're, spending too much time in an echo chamber or somewhere else. And essentially the way Maoist thought control worked was that it's really quite spectacular. I mean, they would work out what is it about you that you most respected. Yeah, so I don't know, maybe you're proud of the fact that you're, I don't know, very, very moral or something. And then they would find examples when you were immoral and just hammer that, basically saying your individuality is not what you think. You're the opposite of what you thought. To kind of breaking your sense of self and then rebuilding it again. You were meant to write these confessions about how bad you were and how you become a good communist now. But as you did that, you had to do that to such an extent that you believed it. So you gave them the first confession. They're like, we don't believe this. And you have to keep on doing it and doing it and doing it until you became one with the image of yourself that you'd performed. Yeah, the performing you was meant to override the real you. Obviously, that was a long process, but this manipulation of emotion, this sort of adopting a new thought process, and then this performing a new self is I think very deep in its understanding of how human beings can interact with propaganda as a source of identity creation, which is where it gets really interesting. Um, but the way people withstood that is very interesting. So they withstood that by never allowing themselves to feel bad or feel very good the way that the Maoist wanted. They'd learned to sort of like remove their emotions from what was going on. They do that through various tricks, through humor sometimes, but just through being very aware of the emotions that they were being forced into. So managed to distance themselves from their emotions. Secondly, being very aware of what the Maoists were doing. Yeah, why do they want them to do this? Always being very aware. Okay, I am being used in a propaganda exercise by the Maoist state in order to push a certain line. Yeah, so the awareness of what was going on helped people give distance to it. And then finally, they like people who managed to survive this. They sort of counterbalance the identity they were being forced into with creative endeavors, just little ones. Somebody would write a little diary about their own childhood, just to remember who they really were, or somebody else did sort of drawings of themselves with their mother to remember who they really were. So to counteract the identity that was being foisted onto you, you had like you went through these little rebellious acts of creative integrity. So look, obviously, very few listeners, none I hope, have to go through anything like true indoctrination. But that idea of your emotions get messed with, yeah? So you're feeling things that you're not in control of. The idea that you're being forced to think in certain ways that are just using you for certain aims. And then finally, the ability to express yourself in very little ways artistically. I don't mean with a big A, but just a little A. I think those are very, very good underlying principles with which to resist manipulation in much less strenuous circumstances.
Let's talk a little more on that word you mentioned in there, performative. And so much of what misinformation, disinformation, propaganda is performative, both from those delivering it and then to some degree from those who are, as you said, sort of going along with it, but they don't really believe it. Um, and it's become an entertainment form. I mean, when we look around the world, especially at some of the worst actors, the misinformation or disinformation is presented in an entertainment format, in a reality television style format. So as we think about that performative, one would think that you can separate the acting version of yourself from the real version of yourself. And
Yeah.
knowing that there's two versions in and of itself helps to separate this performance from the reality. But for many people, it feels like they buy into the performance. And that's the magic, if you will, of a disinformation campaign. What do you think it is about those who practice this at a very effective level that get them to break people down from the understanding of performance versus reality? Is it simply getting into the things that matter most to them? Is it making them feel part of a community so they drop their guard? Like, what is the magic formula there that changes what we can all see as a performance art into blending of reality and fiction?
So do you mean on the people pushing it or the way they get people to play along with it?
The
Because
way they get people to not just play along, but to really buy into it as if they're watching reality.
yeah, that's a great question. I mean, so the word disinformation isn't very helpful here in the sense that it's not about lies and truth. Yeah. What what successful propagandists do is create a reality which taps into very, very deep emotional needs, um, and also then uh, plays into very deep cognitive needs, and creates both an identity and a story to live by. So it's sometimes worth going back to the Nazis simply because they're still our kind of definition of evil propaganda. And when you deconstruct what they did, I think you see versions of this everywhere. Not that everybody's like the Nazis, it's just that this is just how malign propaganda works. So, firstly, it is the normalization of often repressed and taboo feelings. So, allowing people to feel anger, a sense of superiority, a sense of um, a sense of togetherness in a community. You know, there's a reason that some of the most malign propaganda affects communities that are very, very discombobulated, deracinated, atomized. We saw what happened with COVID when we were all living separately online. Suddenly, you get like QAnon and all these crazy conspiracy theories emerging as a way to give people a sense of community at a time of total atomization. And you see that socially when societies move in structural ways from the countryside to the city. They're very, very vulnerable to these huge propaganda, often malign propaganda um, interventions. So normalization of taboo feelings, and many people looking at the Nazis talked about how these normally middle class Germans would go to Nazi rallies and become these balls of hate. And that has often to do with the leader. The leader normalizes this behavior, and the leader himself might be very narcissistic and angry, which makes him, on the one hand, unappealing for a lot of people, but for the others, that he normalizes the worst of themselves. And we often think, why are people attracted to narcissistic leaders who are clearly very self-centered? It's because they allow you to be self-centered too. They're normalizing the worst in us. So that's a huge factor in all of this, and you can see it across the world in many propagandas today, and obviously Hitler is the most obvious example. The feeling of togetherness, of community, of the crowd, where we can give up some of your individuality, where you are part of a superior crowd to an inferior outgroup. That's a very, very rewarding experience. But then moving on from that, the successful propagandists will create storylines about existence. It'll be the identity, but then that will be turned into a massive storyline you can live in. So the Nazis is like, and Nazi news was all about this. It was non-stop. Brave Aryans taking on the evil radical left terrorist. Literally, that's kind of what they'd say. The radical left terrorist Jewish conspiracy. Yeah. Full of victories and losses and stuff like that. And what the successful propagandist does, and I think now it's more possible than ever because we spend so much of our times online, is essentially substitute reality with this media-driven story. And what does happen in reality has to be kind of shoved into that story. So the story comes first, and reality is kind of shoved into it. And that worked with Hitler brilliantly until the invasion of the Soviet Union. Yeah, that's when the whole thing started to come apart, and reality started to intervene so strongly. There started to be this kind of like tension between reality and the story. But before that, victory after victory after victory in the Second World War, it really felt that his crazy story was real. Um, but now that and Putin does this, I think, now this is even more accentuated because of the preponderance of media. You can just live your life online. Many of us do, frankly, which gives propagandists incredible opportunities to really put story first and just suck up whichever bits of evidence or life they need to reinforce that story. Or in the case of someone like JD Vance, openly saying, I'm going to make stories up as long as they fit the emotional narrative I want to communicate. He said that openly. He doesn't deny that. It was just so interesting. He just says that, yes, that's what I do. And um, and often there's collapses. Often it doesn't work out. But because people desire to live in these stories and desire these narratives, um, because of that, they'll often override the facts in order just to, or override the evidence, or ignore what's happening on the ground in order just to make the overall narrative work. And they'll often deny it for as long as possible, or they'll dismiss it. Um, and because people desire to live in this, firstly, they've been emotionally rewarded. They have a new collective identity they like. They might well have a new personal identity they like. There might also be a hell of a lot of incentives to live in the story. And they will often push away the truth for as long as possible.
Is it nearly always, both today and historically, based in a grievance? In other words, creating a narrative that is fundamentally based in some inner resentment towards either another group or just your situation? Or have you seen examples where propagandists actually can use more of a positive, if you will, a rallying identity of yourself in a more positive light that doesn't have to have an enemy?
Well, I mean, life is full of conflict. There's always an enemy. It depends whether that enemy is, you sort of dehumanize them and turn humans into unhumans. Yeah, but it's all life and storytelling is like, what is the challenge? How do we get over it? Is it something in us? Is it something systemic? Is it like that doesn't mean you have to dehumanize the enemy, which is what's happening here, and then basically not deal with your problems. I mean, this is the thing with these narratives, they're getting away from the real problems. So, oh yeah, there's many examples of pro-democratic forces getting this right. I mean, there's often a compromise. There's often something flawed in their storytelling as well, because there's no pure good and evil. But parts of the victory of sort of democracy at the end of the Cold War, sort of 1989, was all about sort of like, gaining freedom. The emotional story was all about freedom. The emotional story was all about overcoming tyranny. That's a very compelling emotional story as well. Um, Actually, it was often tied to national rights and human rights together, so the liberation of nations across Eastern Europe. So strong collective identity, strong personal feelings, and obviously a great story of the dissident and the citizen overcoming authoritarianism and tyranny. So that was clearly very compelling. If you want something much more complicated, you might want to get back to Eisenhower and the use of freedom narratives at the start of the Cold War, which were done with a lot of intentionality, but also obviously contained, to put it mildly, a lot of hypocrisy. Um, um, but then, in a way, many freedom movements, whether it's the movement to end apartheid or the civil rights movement, were all about storytelling. I mean, if you look at the work that Martin Luther King did, nothing was accidental. They were doing campaigns and provocations with the intent to create a story and bring about a very, very just aim. But they were definitely thinking like storytellers, definitely thinking like so that's where we get into this problem. What do we mean by propaganda? Is it a negative word? But if we mean like turning our politics into storytelling that motivates people, that gives people meaning, and that changes things, you may want to give it a different name. Maybe the other side do propaganda, we do strategic communications if you want, but it's definitely storytelling. And the great problem now, of course, is that small d Democrats across the world have lost that ability. Sadly, the autocrats or the populists are very good at it. They live by stories, almost too much. You know, we see that right now in Minneapolis, where the U.S. government seems to have got, they had a story they were trying to sort of project and generate, and it sort of backfired on them because ICE have been brutal. Um, but small d Democrats are very bad at this, whether it's European countries trying to face off the threat of Russia and America. They're very good at technocratic solutions, but not very good at bringing everything together into a story. And even in America, where people are natural storytellers because of American culture, I think. Um, if small d Democrats want to really compete with the kind of illiberal populists, they're going to have to learn how to take all these different moments, the corruption of the Trump family, the brutality in Minnesota, um, whatever's happening with the Fed, all these different moments, and turn them into a larger story. Or else they're just flashes, and that's not enough for people. People need a bigger story, and they want to know what story you're for. That's you've got to gather the sins of the other into a coherent story, which shouldn't be too hard. And then you've got to say what your story is going to be. And I think that's justifiable complaint in America. One side comes with storytelling, and the other side comes with bar charts. And guess who wins?
So I know you have referenced, and I'd love for you to share this with our audience a little bit, a sort of use case of a small d democratic country using the tools of disinformation against an authoritarian regime. And I'm referencing, I believe Sefton Delmer is the name of,
Yeah.
and it's a very complicated. So I encourage people, and we'll put links to your works and to your book in this, to go and read more about it. But maybe for the purposes of our conversation, at a high level, if you can share a little bit about that case study, if you will, and the complications it brings to a democratic society when you're trying to counter authoritarianism, but you're using some of the tactics, and in doing so, compromising maybe some of your own values.
Yeah. Yeah. But I think actually, I think you can quite easily pass apart the positive and the negative lessons of Sefton Delmer's career. Sefton Delmer basically led British special propaganda operations against the Nazis. So he created a whole armada of radio stations, newspapers, leaflets, postcards, the whole thing, aimed at undermining the hold of Nazi propaganda over Germans, especially over German soldiers, but also over civilians. And he basically didn't think that by 1941, when he started working, when Britain was fighting Germany on its own, that there was any hope of finding some sort of like great democratic rebellion movement in Germany. He had a pretty bleak view of human nature and certainly a very bleak view of Nazi Germany. And he was like, forget all that. What we have to do is, well, what he's called, look for the Germans in a pig dog. Use the worst of them against them, and use in many ways jujitsu the power of Nazi propaganda back at itself. So he would create radio stations that were even more far right than Nazi propaganda and attack Nazi propaganda from them. Yeah. So, if he was working in America, he'd create a Steve Bannon further than Steve Bannon in order to fuck up Steve Bannon. Um, and the tools that he used really went to the kind of psychological vulnerabilities of authoritarian propaganda. His content was full of violence and pornography because he thought the first thing you had to do if you want to get these audiences is take back strong emotions. He created alternative identities. So he was very aware that the Nazis' power came from creating the communal identity of the Nazi folk, the people. So he stressed the identity of church, of army, of region. And he was always undermining the Nazi concept of the self. So the Nazi propaganda was full of, I don't know, beautiful bodies and stuff like that. Aryan, you're meant to feel gorgeous when you watch Nazi propaganda with its naked torsos full of muscly sinews. And Delma's counter propaganda was full of these kind of like graphic descriptions of, the festering bodies of soldiers on the front and like wasting away with disease and syphilis and all incredibly graphic. But at the same time, he told the stories of German civilians and people on the front with incredible detail and intimacy. He had this vast research operation to find out what was conditions like were on the front. So basically, he was basically saying, like, I can describe your life better than the Nazi propaganda. I can give you useful things like how to get money from your superiors, how to make money on the black market, how to defect, how to feign illness, all this useful stuff that will help you survive the war, but also will be terrible for the Nazi economy and war effort. And I can give you an alternative communal identity. I can give you all these things, which the Nazis can't. Just stop fighting effectively. That's basically the message. And save yourselves. So he wasn't trying to appeal to anybody's higher values. He really. I'm not sure he thought people had them generally, but he definitely didn't think they were useful then. His shows were incredibly funny and successful. Like something like half of German soldiers tuned into them. And I think, it's very hard to measure effects, but in terms of audience share, it was very big. In terms of, we have some qualitative evidence of people defecting and saying they did that because of his thing, because of his radio programs, or whole towns giving themselves up because they'd been listening to his programs, or whole garrisons. And the Nazis were themselves very freaked out by the success of the media he was projecting. But he did use disinformation. He'd smear people. A lot of this stuff was targeting various individuals in the system and then just destroying their careers. And he tried to usually find the evidence that he could, but when he didn't, he'd use disinformation. And certainly in terms of, immoral attacks on people and sowing doubt and sowing division. I mean, that was what all his mission was, to kind of sow division between the Nazis and the people, generals and soldiers and so on. And he was, he described it that way. He described it as a judo thing where he was using the Nazis' own propaganda against them, or the tricks of their own propaganda against them. And after the war, he was kind of forgotten because the British, I think, felt uncomfortable with the idea that they'd been pumping out far-right pornography in order to undermine the Nazi war effort. It was meant to be our finest hour. We were meant to be noble things, and here we're using lies, sex, and hate, really, rather than honor, truth, and whatever else it was we were using. But I think if you look, you just need to glance around today to see why Delma's probably right. I mean, I've made lots of lovely shows for places like the Atlantic about, the dangers to American democracy, and they're very worthy, and they're not really aimed at anybody but our own political tribe, and hopefully they give our own political tribe a degree of sort of precision to think about these issues. But they don't affect, I don't know, the MAGA hardcore. The MAGA hardcore have been split by the Epstein files, which is just the sort of thing that Delma would have been doing. Yeah, spreading rumors and no, it's not just the spreading the rumors of sexual deviance, which is always good copy. It's taking their own narratives and using them against them. That's what he would have done. Instead of saying our narratives, he'd say these people are so far gone. The only thing you can now do is use their energy against them, their narratives against them. And I think you see that also with the anti-Semitism scandals, which are rocking the sort of like the MAGA that was always there, that was always just below the surface, and it's been surfaced, and it's ripping them apart. So I think, and also in Russia, look at Russia. I mean, like, there's the most important voices that Putin is genuinely rattled by come from the far right. They don't come from the Democrats. They come from Prigozhin. They come from Girkin. These are kind of far right characters who are basically saying, we're going to clean up the army. We're going to be more effective. Let's get rid of all the foreigners. The elites are incompetent and corrupt. We have to be more Nazi, basically. um, and it's a very dark and unpleasant fact, but it seems that Delma has a point when you're talking about, a certain type of movement which is really impenetrable from any outside influence. All you can do is use their own dark energies against them. But the cost exists. Delma saw his own career as a morality tale. And in my book about him, I stress that a lot. There's a huge cost that comes with that. A, to credibility. B, you're creating kind of new phantoms which take on a life of their own. So after the war, Delvin was horrified to know that a lot of the narratives he'd put out there, that there was a split between the army and the party, had been used by generals after the war to get back into power. They'd say, well, look, we were never with the party. We were always our own thing. And Delma felt partly responsible for that because he'd created this image of, the German soldier who doesn't actually agree with the Nazis. So all things come out of the Pandora's box when you start playing these games, and there are no easy answers. And maybe it was wrong of me to think that people needed a complicated book, but there you go. I did one.
So let's talk a little bit about what it means to fight this battle in the modern era in a liberal democracy, let's say, in a place that values free speech, that is disinclined to censor or to shut down accounts or shut down media forms. And so that is not going to be an effective way to counter these attacks, these disinformation attacks. But there has to be some sort of a balance when it's pretty clear that lies, distortions, emotionally charged content is always going to spread faster than what is often the boring truth. And it's the truth is often at a disadvantage because it is less interesting. If you take censorship off the table, if you take government intervention in public speech off the table, what are the effective tools in a liberal democracy to counter the very clear disinformation efforts that are being used to undermine the society or perhaps the stability and the integrity of the system of democracy?
That's a fantastic question. I have a new book that I'm just finishing all about that. There's so many different levels to this. I think we have to stop thinking about this as like a problem of disinformation or some lies. We're talking about the kind of like structural breakdown of the public sphere as we knew it. We had an ecology where you always had lies and nasty propaganda. What's happened now, though, is that the way we thought we would balance that in a larger kind of public sphere or public square would be through freedom of speech and pluralism. We had lots of opinions, and we had an idea about the marketplace of ideas, that the best information would win. And we'd have lots of different voices, including extremist ones. That's always been part of democracy, but they'd all be balanced out. And in the end, we'd have enough cohesion to be able to debate things. The best ideas would win. And in that kind of process of searching for solutions and debates, we have democracy. So I think it's that whole system has broken down. People have disappeared into echo chambers where they can't talk to each other anymore. Trust in kind of media has collapsed, so there's no place anymore to have that common discussion. Social media has meant that it's now so easy, as you say, to just flood the zone with shit. AI might make things a lot worse. The latest research about what's known as AI swarms basically makes troll and bot farms look pedestrian. Just the ability to just like send these kind of locust swarms of AI driven manipulation, which is both going to be mass and yet incredibly targeted because it'll be constantly learning how to both keep the big message but then find your individual vulnerability and doing that automatically. I mean, it's that's changed the game. You know, the sort of like the sort of architecture that we had for a democratic debate and a democratic society is breaking down. Which is partly why you have these sort of calls that you had at the start of the 20th century repeating, like, we can't handle democracy. That's the danger. The danger is we go, this is just all too messy. People are too easily manipulable. Truth has been lost to such a degree that therefore the Chinese Communist Party or Peter Thiel have to step in and rule us. That's the danger. It's the idea of, can democracy survive in this environment? So it's not about like one piece of disinformation or another. There was always disinformation. You know, there's always been lies. I mean, the history of well, look at the history of the American Revolution and Benjamin Franklin, all that he was doing. Come on, it's like, you know, lies, influence, propaganda are part of our part of history. You know, that's fine. It's about the whole system has come crashing down, and in that chaos, the most malign actors are taking advantage. So look, I think there's like 2 steps to this. Well, 3. Let's call it 3, because you always need 3. Always need 3, a 3-act thing. Number 1, the people who say they wish to save democracy have to learn how to compete. That means fighting for every audience. That means working out how you take a moment of vulnerability of the other side and making sure they pay for it. That means getting beyond our self-righteousness and reaching swing voters or swing audiences in ways that are meaningful to them. There's a great line that one of the guys who ran Quid, which was the sort of online campaign to stop Bolsonaro, so like the Brazil's version of Trump from getting re-elected, when they were getting their activists to do campaigns to sort of target swing voters, and the lefty campaigners wanted to sort of focus on the Amazon, basically, and basically they told them, like, do you want to feel righteous or do you want to win? You know, do you want to feel good or do you actually want to say and do the engagement that will get the audiences that we need? So as long as you have an electoral democracy, you still have chances. But then everybody who says they support democracy have to come together into a vast social movement. I mean, we know that from Brazil, from Poland, from Chile, from all the successful examples, from Serbia, all the successful examples against illiberal populists and kind of the softer autocrats, is that as long as there is an election, you have to create a coalition bigger than the others. So that's about kind of like, you know, if this is a crisis in democracy, you have to make sure that you're in a position to save it. And that's creating a social movement, not just around elections, but that really sets that aim. And you're going to have to do some of the subversive stuff. You're going to have to break apart their coalition. You're going to have to encourage defectors from their coalition. You know, it's most pushbacks happen when you can get parts of the other's coalition to recognize that having a court system that's independent is more important than owning the libs. So that's very important. So what you need is a social movement, you know, based around saving democracy, justice, and to a certain extent, truth, or the institutions that produce truth or produce facts. So you have to compete, you know, and if you don't do that, nothing else will really work. And small d Democrats tend to be terrible at that. They tend to bicker. They tend to sort of fall apart into their little camps. But that's the first stage. And there's a role for media in that, and there's a role for campaigners in that, and civil society in that. But then there's the next stage, which is we kind of have to do at the same time, which is then build a new public sphere. Yeah. What do I mean by that? It's not so much about countering disinformation. It's about creating technology and communications institutions where truth matters, that enable productive democratic debate where evidence plays a role. And again, there's examples of that from across the world. Look at the work that Audrey Tang, the former Minister for Digital, has done in Taiwan, creating pro-social media platforms, as she calls them. So technology that is designed to find commonality between people, that is designed to elevate evidence, as opposed to just generate hate. One of the things that Audrey actually innovated in Taiwan is what we now know as community notes on X, which is the one really good thing about X. That's something that came out of various experiments in Taiwan about how do you create crowdsourced fact-checking, essentially. But it's all about how do you create technology, a culture of debate that makes democracy possible, that makes evidence valued. So that's the second stage. Yeah, and that requires a huge investment in research and in technology, because at the moment the way our technology is built, it doesn't favor that. Yeah, so someone has to start supporting that. Yeah, whether centrally or in a much more sort of decentralized way, somebody has to invest in that. So that's the second part. Creating a new public sphere where truth is valued, and then I suppose the third one is really rethinking our well, not rethinking, actually just thinking properly about our fundamental freedoms and rights. So at the moment, freedom of speech, which is probably the most critical right and freedom in this issue set, has been kind of hacked to mean we can spread as much hate and lies as we want. Actually, freedom of speech is a much deeper thing. Freedom of speech is the right to receive information as well. And that should include the right to receive information about how algorithms work. Is somebody's voice being oppressed or elevated on X? Who's in charge of that? Who has oversight of that? How is my data being used? How's somebody else's data being used? The moment, if we're in a public sphere, then it's sort of completely in the dark. It's sort of shrouded in this thick smoke, and we really don't understand what influences which information we see and how it influences us. Then building on that, I think we have to start thinking about other fundamental freedoms that we've never really thought about properly, like freedom of thought, which is a fundamental freedom that nobody's really thought about what the hell it means. It's never actually been used in any cases. There's been no kind of like freedom of thought treaty case. There's been many on freedom of speech, but nothing on freedom of thought. I'm talking about at the international level, and international institutions. And it's a really difficult concept. What does it mean to have freedom of thought? What does it mean to have autonomy? Yeah, we've never really thought about it. We've always thought about speech, censorship versus speech. We've never thought about freedom of thought. But there's a very strong case to be made that social media, the digital world we live in, and especially AI, are designed in a way that they're undermining our freedom of thought. There is no space to think autonomously if generative AI is giving you answers where you don't know where the hell they came from. Yeah, you have no idea. I mean, sometimes there's a link when you ask Gen AI questions, but half the time it's just giving you answers and you're living in them. Now imagine that starts happening at scale, not just like you looking up a restaurant review, but something a little bit more fundamental about history, about democracy, about your own rights. So the space to engage critically is shrinking. And the remedy isn't stopping the technology, it's designing it in a way that allows for critical thinking. And beyond that, there's issues with privacy, which has been kind of just abolished, really, in the digital model that we know now. How can we regain privacy? How can you regain control over your own data? So we have to start thinking through those things, because at the end of the day, our democratic discourse was grounded and kind of protected by these incredibly powerful legal ideas. And we don't have to redefine them. We have to actually work out we have to remember what their true definition was, because it was much more than the kind of very, very abbreviated and in some ways perverted meaning that's being given to them by the people who are interested in spreading hate and lies.
So my last question, to kind of tie everything together and maybe look into the future a little bit. A lot of what we've talked about, and a lot of what is in your books and others on the topic, talks about the role of nation states in deploying these tools of propaganda to advance their policies, their interests, often emanating from a government or a political movement. But we live in an era now where there are some very, very large companies, especially in the technology space, which are in some cases equal to or greater than the power of a nation state. Those owners and investors have their own interests that may not align with any nation state. They are independent unto themselves. How should we be thinking about how private companies and private actors can use the same tools that nation states have used forever to try to influence policy when they may not actually have a favored country, political ideology? Their motive is either profit or power for themselves. That feels new to me. Maybe it's not. Maybe you have other examples of something similar to it. And how do we guard against that kind of malign actor versus the more established two ideologies from two different countries who are trying to stake out a place in the world for themselves?
Yeah, no, there's been many attempts to really define, the power of Elon Musk um, historically. It does feel like late medieval. We had these sort of grand dukes who were as big as kings. The Grand Duke of Burgundy or something, who was, or these, yeah, uh, these characters who are not quite states, but whose power and wealth is greater than states, and who act in some ways without the restraints of states, though they may lack, a monopoly on violence for now. Um, Look, ideally, the ideal vision is that in the democratic states, at least, would have common norms around how you know, how you regulate this kind of power through transparency, through a certain amount of demonopolization, through having lots of them. I mean, it's just messed up when you have three companies dominating everything, by, you know, the old, the, you know, you know, the same as you had with the big American oil companies under Teddy Roosevelt. But for that to really work, and we were heading towards it, you need the democratic blocs to align, and most importantly, America and Europe. And we seem to be heading that way between kind of Lena Khan in the US and the Digital Service Act and the EU and Australian things. And there were many stupidities, by the way. I'm actually very, very against laws on disinformation. I think that's both stupid and wrong and unworkable. Also, just philosophically wrong in so many ways, but also unworkable, and also a misdiagnosis of the problem. I think that the stress has to be on transparency, on algorithmic transparency, a certain amount of demonopolization. And we were heading in kind of the same vector. And now, actually, what's happened now, which is so dangerous, is that America is broken with the rest and now is using its vast arsenal and its vast kind of leverage on issues to do with security or trade or tariffs to push the interests of its dauphins, probably because it wants their help in their own domestic politics. So that's what's happening. It's not just these. There was, like with any big business, there's ways of regulating it if you take a common position. But what's happened now is a very, very different dynamic, which um, which is sadly, instead of seeing a cohesion in the democratic space, is going to lead to, well, a lot of tension and maybe even a certain amount of, well, certainly the America has kind of announced that it will practice political warfare against Europe. I mean, that's in the national security strategy, that America sees it as its obligation to help the parties in Europe that they are aligned with, and which also just happen to be aligned with their positions on technology.
So, as we wrap up, I'm curious of the things that you're working on. You mentioned a couple of books that you're either working on or they'll be coming out soon. Are there any topics that you're studying now, researching now, that we didn't cover in this conversation that our audience maybe should, take away as previews of works that are still to come from you, or topics that maybe aren't in the headlines today, but you look over the next year or two and you think that they could be?
So listen, something I'm very, very focused on is, which has never been a major focus of me, but of mine, but it has become one, is the future of kind of justice in a world where norms have gone wrong. I mean, I've been very focused on war crimes investigations in Russia's invasion of Ukraine, but I think I'm very, very interested, by this confluence of truth and justice. And it's been very striking in America that because America didn't go through a reset around January 6th, which I think would have been in a moment, for the nation to have a reset to go, here's what happened, here's who was responsible. I'm not saying Donald Trump would have been found guilty, by the way, he may not have been, but at least we would have heard his position on the events. So it's very important for societies when they're as polarized and a kind of, you know, political civil war like in America to go through this moment of taking stock, reflection, and the rediscovery of social truths. I'm not talking about scientific truth, but social truths. This is what happened. This is what we believe in. This is what our norms are. This is what is abnormal. Here is the difference between debate and whatever. Here's the difference between truth and lies. And here's what we don't know. It's interesting. I've only been here 4 years, but I thought January 6th having a proper project around that, not just the Jack Smith case. We often shrink legality to just the courts. It's not just that. It's would have needed a Truth and Reconciliation Committee, kind of local people's courts going through all this. A process of memorialization. It was such an opportunity to, in quite a soft way, to reset society. And the vast amount of Americans did not approve of what happened on January 6th. And instead, it just became, well, the trial never happened. In the sense that, but again, I don't think one legal trial would have solved this. I think you needed a whole effort around this. And now we're in a position where you look at the January 6th website today and the truth there is topsy-turvy. And where overall truth is in the tailspin and justice is on the ropes. And these things go together. And it's not just sort of like sweet words. Democracies can function if there is some sort of alliance between truth and justice. They have to at least be somewhat reinforcing each other. And I see that, but it's not just an American crisis. We see that across the world. We see that across the world with the breakdown of the international rules-based order, if it ever existed. But it's like the claim that the powerful will be punished if they lie and do crime, and they will be held accountable, and society will understand that they did wrong, has kind of gone. So I'm very interested in how one can fix that.
Good spot to wrap on. If folks would like to learn more about you or your recent works or books, are you active on social media channels or any particular book or books that you would ask people to maybe start with if they wanted to learn more about your work?
Yeah, I'm not. Because I've been writing a book myself, another book. I haven't been doing much on social media, but so right now you can follow me on X, but I'm afraid I'm a bit sporadic. Right now, just go to Amazon, go to my Amazon page, and my books are there. I think usually for Americans, the first one, which is about Russia, but is um, uncannily similar to what we see in America. It's called "Nothing is True and Everything is Possible." Um, have a look at that because I think that'll give Americans. I know you have a global audience, but it'll give anyone, I think, a perspective on their own societies by looking at it through the development of Putin's propaganda machine in the early 2000s. It's also fun. So I think that's a good one. The last one, I'm if you want a bit of slightly forgotten World War II history, then I think that's a really fun one as well. But you've got to, I suppose it's more for the history buffs out there.
Fair enough. We'll put links to those in the description of this program. Peter, thank you so much for taking time to speak with our audience today. From the earliest days of doing this show and thinking about the guests we were going to invite, how we were going to conduct the show, how much of the show I would dedicate to my own opinions, it was always important to me to act responsibly, no matter how large or small my audience was, to ensure that any guest that we were bringing on was somebody who was there for the right reasons, that they wanted to share a perspective, that they wanted to engage in a true conversation, that they had some deep insight that anybody out there with a curious mind would find worthy of listening to, but who were not coming on the show presuming to have all the answers, pushing information that was questionable in terms of its provability, or who were straight out sharing disinformation, deliberate lies, things they knew not to be true, misinformation, things they had just not looked into and they were presenting as fact rather than opinion, or straight up propaganda, pushing an ideology and a viewpoint for a political end to influence people's votes, or toward an ideological end to influence their actions, often towards a profit motive. And so I think we have been very successful, but only because it's been an intentional decision. In every guest that we book, in every topic that we cover, in every segment that I record, in any opinions that I share, we are very careful on this show to ensure that we present content that we don't know if it's real or not as opinion, nothing more than opinion. And that information that can be provable, historical facts, things of that nature, that we bring on the right authoritative hosts who have done the research, who've done the homework, who are in a position to be able to share true, verifiable, vetted realities and facts. But my point in sharing all this is that it's an intentional act. It is very easy to slip into misinformation. It's very easy to become a victim of it. It's very easy to propagate it accidentally, to hear something that somebody that you trust to some degree said and to simply repeat it. And it's very, very easy when you're doing a show like this to blur the lines between reality and opinion, between verifiable facts and unverified, unvetted thoughts and perspectives. And there's a value to both of these things. We want to share. If you're a curious person, you both want to know the things that are truly provable. You want to understand the elements that are debatable, and you want to hear people's different interpretations and perspectives of a common reality. That's part of a healthy conversation. But it is only through a deliberate decision that you can arrive at something that is objective, is fair, and respects people's intelligence. Disinformation is deliberate. We talked about that in this episode, that it's people deliberately lying to you and manipulating you and misleading you. Misinformation is far more prevalent. It's more innocent, perhaps, in its spread, that the intent may not be there, but the effect may still be dramatic and harmful. And the only way it seems to me that you can truly guard against these things is to have a tremendous amount of proactive self-awareness, to know your weak spots, to know your vulnerabilities, to know your emotional triggers, to know all of the things that people in your life can use to trigger you to do what they want you to do rather than what you want to do. And so as I was conducting this interview and I was doing research and homework for it, I was reading some of the books that Peter has written, it occurred to me that the easiest way to avoid becoming an unwitting or witting victim of misinformation, of disinformation, of propaganda, is to simply have a deep and honest understanding of your own worldview. the things that you have biases towards, the things that you feel passionately about because of your own lived experiences, the way that you feel when people are addressing you, when stories are popping up in your news feeds, the way that you feel when somebody in your life brings a topic to you, good or bad. That it's important that you are able to identify in and of yourself the buttons that others can press, maybe the buttons that you even press yourself. And that the best way to guard against being the victim of a misinformation or disinformation campaign is to simply step back and take a moment and understand how you're reacting to the information you're receiving. It is my goal that when you wrap up listening to any one of my interviews, any one of these shows, that you simply contemplate that rather than have you feel, I want you to think. And I understand that the podcast format, like any format of media, is most profitable and generally most popular when it leaves you with feelings, when it evokes anger or rage or maybe joy because I've said everything that you want to hear. But I think it's more valuable to leave you thinking, to put your emotions aside and allow your logic, your analytical side, your inner, most thoughtful voice, that when the waters are calm in your soul and you don't have an immediate reaction to everything you see and hear, that you can take in the information and dispassionately determine what you think about it. And in that way, I hope that this program can be a light in an ocean of propaganda and misinformation, disinformation shows, many of whom in the misinformation space are innocent enough. They're not trying to harm anyone. They're not trying to mislead anyone, but they are definitely trying to trigger your emotions to do something that's profitable for them. We're not trying to do that. We're trying to evoke thoughts. We're trying to evoke conversation, perspectives, and respectful dialogue. And so my call to you all as you listen to this show, and I hope you'll go back and listen to it again and really pick up on all the nuances of what Peter had to share as somebody who has studied this unique form of information. He doesn't like the term information warfare. Let's call it information massaging. And the formats of media over the years that have been used to shape public opinion. I hope that you will walk away from this with a deeper understanding of the forces in your life who are trying to encourage you to do things that they want you to do. And I want you to make decisions that are good for you. And I think you'll be able to best do that by simply having a deeper understanding of yourself, what you believe in your default mode, what you can be convinced into, what you disagree with and why, and to be able to sense the emotions as they rise up as you're triggered by the things you read, hear, see, or feel. And not to suppress those feelings, but to simply be aware of them and to steer yourself away from the most extreme triggers and towards the most thoughtful dialogue. And I hope this show will be one of those places that when you need to calm the waters of your soul and stop yourself from going down the emotional rabbit hole, that you can come back here and find a center and find peace and know that there's people who come on this program whose only goal is to share knowledge, perspectives, and allow us all to learn more about the world around us. If you'd like to reach out to me and give reactions to this show, I always love to hear from listeners. The easiest way to do that is to email me directly at info@brianjmatos.com. You can follow me on your favorite social media feeds and send me direct messages through any of those social media sites. And of course, you can find us on our YouTube channel where you can leave comments, you can share and subscribe to our videos and be the first to receive the preview clips of forthcoming shows, and engage with other listeners who leave comments on both our interview episodes as well as our preview clips. It is an honor to host this show and to share all of these conversations with you. I look forward to sharing many more in the weeks and months to come. And until we talk again, I invite you all and encourage you all to stay curious.